But without any further ado, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Kelly Cope is a professor and extension specialist in the Plants, Soils, and Climate Department at Utah State University. Her research focuses on landscape water conservation, irrigation technologies, and sustainable turfgrass management. She directs Utah State University's Center for Water Efficient Landscaping and is the U.S. representative to the International Turfgrass Society. We are really grateful to have Dr. Cope this evening and her expertise. I'm going to turn the time over to you. I am here. I'm going to turn my camera off, but if you need anything, I'm right here. Let's make sure you can share and all that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeremiah. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation to be with you all this evening. I am in Utah, so not there with you in Wyoming, but I do end up doing a fair bit of work there because I don't believe you have a turfgrass specialist there at the University of Wyoming. So having said that, I'm always happy to speak with you and answer questions that may come up. And I did notice a couple in the Q&A, so we'll get to those at the end, I think. But I'd like to begin with just some basic information about grasses on this planet, because I think there's a lot of misinformation and perhaps misunderstanding about what grasses are and what they require. And just for a little bit of background, because I'm guessing that not many of you know this, but there are actually more than 11,000 species of perennial grasses on this planet, and they grow naturally on every single continent and in almost every terrestrial ecosystem. So really broad distribution across the world. They're also, and this may be news to you, huge contributors to food production in the world. So by that, I mean that 4 of the top 5 food crops in the world are grasses. So things like rice, corn, things like that. And 3 of them provide nearly 60% of all human caloric intake worldwide. So we're focusing here on grasses as an ornamental plant, but they have a much more broad functionality than that. So I'm not here to talk about grasses as food crops, but rather functional grasses that we have in our urban and suburban landscapes. And as far as those go, there are about 20 species of perennial grasses that are suitable for the uses we have for them in our homes, athletic fields, golf courses, other sports fields, etc., even along roadsides. So while those types of grasses don't feed us, they do provide a whole lot of ecosystem and environmental services. So things like you see here, things like controlling erosion, things like reducing stormwater runoff. Very importantly, cooling the atmosphere. That's an area of research that I work a lot in right now, sequestering carbon, filtering water. So they perform a whole lot of functions, which is why I often say all grasses are functional, even though you may have heard some grasses characterized as non-functional. But they do provide all of these benefits, and they are plants like any other. So of course, they're also producing oxygen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these benefits just to sort of set the stage for what I'll talk about later, which is more focused on how we manage turf grasses through drought. But one of the major benefits grasses provide is that they provide soil protection. And they actually, and the world's best soils actually evolved under perennial grass cover. And it has to do with the fact that these grasses deposit carbon in the soil because of their extensive root systems. This then improves soil structure, air movement, water movement, and overall productivity. So today, where our urban soils are often quite disturbed or perhaps compacted, in some cases even destroyed, perennial grasses can actually be used to rehabilitate those areas and restore soils to healthy conditions. And in fact, the US EPA often recommends grasses on construction sites because they can protect soils, and research shows that they're significantly better at protecting soils than artificial materials. Now, another benefit that I did briefly mention, but I'll get into a little bit more detail here, that we get from grasses is with stormwater retention and biofiltration. So here, what I'm talking about are the excessive amounts of water that we can sometimes get from rainfall. Jeremiah shared with me that it was raining there today. It's actually raining here a little bit today too, but it could also be from snowmelt or, unfortunately, sometimes from over irrigation. But grasses can help slow the movement of that water and allow it to infiltrate into the soil. And when we have stormwater runoff, particularly from roads and streets and things like that, it can be contaminated with things like gasoline, things like antifreeze, oil, etc. If it's running off from other landscape areas, there may be fertilizers, pesticides, other chemicals from businesses or homes. And grasses can actually help to filter those materials and improve the quality of that water. So the grass in this case is acting as a natural filter to capture pollutants before it can reach other water bodies. So things like lakes, streams, rivers, etc. And that's why grasses are actually grown in stormwater retention basins quite often. And as I mentioned, they do slow the flow of that water, which can help it to infiltrate and then become cleaner. So like all plants, grasses do produce oxygen, and they also absorb carbon dioxide, which helps to improve our air quality. And many factors influence how much oxygen is produced by grasses. So things like temperature, light, moisture, nutrients, all of those things are going to impact how much oxygen is produced. And a little bit more information on the numbers I'm sharing here. The study site that I'm aware of that's closest to us included Los Angeles, California, where this size of lawn has been shown to support the oxygen needs of as many as 28 people. In Dallas, Texas, that might be a little bit different. It could actually support more people, perhaps 34 people. And this is an area of work where we haven't done a lot of local research, neither in Wyoming or Utah, but it is something that I'm beginning to look into now with some of my own research. Now, one of the really interesting things, at least to me, that I'm working on right now is quantifying the amount of atmospheric cooling that we get from turfgrass covered landscapes. So we know, for example, that plants can improve that cooling. Trees can provide cooling by shade, of course. But grasses also provide cooling through the process of evapotranspiration, which is evaporation from the soil surface and transpiration of moisture through the leaves of the grass plant. And that movement of moisture through the leaves into the atmosphere is actually what provides atmospheric cooling where grasses are concerned. So we know that natural grass really does a great job of moderating heat. It remains cooler than many other surfaces. And just to emphasize that a little bit, I'll go into this photograph on the slide. So these temperatures were all taken within 10 or 20 feet of one another. And I'm not sure if you can read that. I know the numbers are tiny, but in the upper left, the air temperature is 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Upper right, the water temperature at the surface is also 94 degrees Fahrenheit. In the middle left, that is natural grass, in this case Bermuda grass, but the temperature is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Next to it, bare sand is 132 degrees Fahrenheit. Lower left, asphalt is 136 degrees Fahrenheit, but lower right, synthetic or artificial turf, the temperature is 165 degrees Fahrenheit. So compare that 165 degrees to the natural grass temperature of 104, and you can see, obviously, that's a huge difference. I also am aware of other research that's evaluating how much heat is increasing in our cities across the country. And one period, they do the study every 10 years, but in this case, this time frame was 2004 to 2014. And in that 10-year period, Las Vegas had a huge temperature increase of 7.3 degrees Fahrenheit, Albuquerque 5.9, Denver 4.9. So an increase in urban heat. And so if there are things that we can do with landscaping to help mitigate that, that's something that I'm very interested in. Now, another thing that I am also interested in is how much carbon can be sequestered by turfgrass systems. And that's because turfgrass is sometimes characterized as a high input plant material, maybe even having a bad reputation because of it. You know, in our area, often it's because of water requirements or just any other high input management practices that may be employed for turfgrass management. And it's also often criticized because of the equipment that's used to manage turfgrass. So things like mowers, blowers, aerators, etc., which, when they are gasoline powered, do in fact emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But despite that, turfgrasses do still have the capacity to sequester carbon. And when we start thinking about the fact that a lot of turfgrass management equipment now is moving towards battery power, then that also even enhances that ability to sequester carbon even further. So one research paper that I am aware of found that lawn grasses can actually account for 50% of the carbon that's captured in certain cities. So it has a huge potential for being a net sink of carbon for a very long period of time. So as you see here, up to 184 years. So this is another area of research that I'm very focused on as I quantify the benefits that we get from amenity landscapes, including those that contain turf grasses. So with all that as a way of introduction, today what I'm really talking about and focusing on is functional turf grasses and irrigating those turf grasses within the context of what are really serious and ongoing water resource challenges. And that really is the focus this evening. So here we are now in the absolute worst drought of record. The drought that we are currently in is unprecedented in our times. I remember when I first moved to Utah in 2000, we were in a drought then, and I thought, wow, this is a really serious drought. That pales in comparison to where we are today. And just quick story for you. I recently had an opportunity to visit Mesa Verde National Park. And for those of you who are not familiar, this is a national park in the southwest corner of Colorado where the ancient Puebloans lived for many, many years. About 1,500 years ago, there was a community of 40,000 people there. They left that part of the world because of drought. And the park ranger that we were speaking with on our tour told us that if they had experienced the drought that we are currently experiencing right now, they would have actually left the Mesa Verde area 7 years earlier than they actually did. So that was pretty eye-opening to me. I don't think I need to go beyond that just to emphasize how serious the conditions are right now. There you are in Wyoming, plenty of the state in extreme drought. Here I am in Utah, plenty of area of the state also in extreme drought. Most of the rest of the state either in severe or moderate drought. So we have got a tough situation with water. So I'll move on just for a minute. If you'll indulge me, I'll spend just a touch of time on turfgrass physiology, just to emphasize how important water is to managing turf grasses. But water plays a huge role in turf physiology. So it works as a transport medium, meaning it brings nutrients from the soil into the plant. I already mentioned transpiration, where there is moisture moving through the leaves of the turfgrass plant into the atmosphere. It also keeps cells turgid or solid so that they can function properly. It's a component of many different plant parts, a solvent and a catalyst for chemical processes. And it's very important for energy production in the plant as well. So lots of different roles in plants for sure, and certainly within turf grasses as well. But when we're thinking about managing turf grasses through drought, I really like to think about it in terms of the system of turf grass, soil, and water. So how do those three things relate? So, and how do they affect how we manage turf grasses? So turf grasses have to balance their need for carbon dioxide with the potential for drying or desiccation during the process of absorbing carbon dioxide. And that's especially true in environments like ours, where there's a really high evaporative demand from the atmosphere, simply because we don't have a lot of moisture in our atmosphere, especially compared to some other parts of the country. Now, different plant parts, the roots, the xylem, the cuticle, etc., they're all critical to these processes. And they also allow the plant to take up carbon dioxide while still protecting it from drying out. So because water moves through that whole system due to physical forces, and by physical, I mean like the physics of the system, turf grass plants don't really expend a lot of energy themselves to move that water. It's happening due to differences in pressure, but they do expend energy to maintain the plant structures that allow that water movement. So that's how all of those things relate. And now I'm going to leave the topic of physiology and move on to some more practical stuff that I think is what you're probably most interested in. So when we've got turf grasses in our amenity landscapes, you're trying to meet turf grass water requirements for its health and function for sure. But when we've got a drought like we do now, we also, of course, need to be as efficient as we can possibly be with our water resources. So there are some factors that we think about when irrigating turf grasses or considering how much water they require. Different species have different water requirements. And then beyond that, there can be literally hundreds of varieties in a given species. I'll use Kentucky bluegrass as an example. There are literally hundreds of different varieties of Kentucky bluegrass out there. That is just in that one species. Then you start thinking about the other species, and there are that many more options. So that's something we have to consider. We also have to consider what the function is of that turf grass. Is it a home lawn, for example? Is it an athletic field that's getting a lot more traffic and use? Is it something else? So we have to think about that, because that can affect how much water is required. And of course, we have to think about the climate in which it's growing. So here where we are in the West, we're in a dry climate. We have very regular droughts, some more severe than others. So we have to consider that. And we get information from weather stations, for example, that help us determine how different climates affect the turf grass water requirements. We also have to consider how much evapotranspiration is occurring, and weather stations also play a role there. They actually can help us model and quantify the amount of water being lost from that turf grass and soil system, and then relate that back to how much we want to replace. Different grasses have different drought tolerance. Different management practices actually affect how much water is required. So I'm going to talk about those things as I continue. So here, I don't want you to get too bogged down in the specifics. I'm mainly showing you this to demonstrate how different the requirements are across turf grass species, not to mention varieties. I'm not even getting into varieties here. These are just turf grass species that we see commonly used in this part of the country. And you can see water requirements ranging everywhere from very low for crested wheatgrass all the way to high. I need to change that. It should be low to high, because we do have low water use bluegrasses now, and then moderate as well. And same thing for fertility requirements, which are largely focused on nitrogen. But they've got different levels of drought tolerance. They've got different levels of shade tolerance, different mowing quality. So that would describe how they look when they're mowed, and different levels of wear tolerance, which would describe how much traffic they can take before they start to show damage or perhaps need some renovation. So again, this is just really to demonstrate how different they are. Because that's a bit of a pet peeve for me. And that's when, I hear folks, particularly in the water industry, talking about turf grass like it's just one thing. And that is absolutely not the case. There are so many species, as I've mentioned, and so many varieties with really different characteristics. And so it's really much more nuanced than it is sometimes made out to be. So I do just want to share some resources as I'm going along, and I'm happy, very happy to share this presentation. I'm happy to send it to Jeremiah and he can pass it along, or my email will be at the end and I'm happy to share it that way too. But a lot of what we're thinking about with irrigating turf grasses and managing them through drought is addressing the amount of evapotranspiration that's occurring. And I've already touched on this a couple times, but again, the combination of evaporation from the soil surface and transpiration through the leaves of the turfgrass plant. So, you know, as Jeremiah mentioned, I direct our Center for Water Efficient Landscaping here. And so we have developed a lot of different materials around not just turfgrass water conservation, but all aspects of landscape water conservation and aspects of technology that we use to manage irrigation as well. This is one example. So describing how we address irrigation using the concept of evapotranspiration. So this is something that would be very relevant to you in Wyoming as well. Now, as far as the relative evapotranspiration rates of turf grasses go, again, a very wide range. So here's that crested wheatgrass at the top again that's got a very low rate of evapotranspiration, less than 6 millimeters per day. Then here we have at the medium or moderate level some of the fine fescues. So these would include hard fescue, chewing fescue, and red fescue. Then it gets a little bit higher with perennial ryegrass. And then very high, this would be for standard varieties of these grasses. So tall fescue, creeping bentgrass, etc. But again, we do have lower water use varieties of some of these, and I'll talk more about that as I'm going through. Now, I do also just want to point out, I went back to this because I want to point out something else here. So we often talk about turfgrass species, but we have another broad categorization of turf grasses, which is either cool season or warm season. And it's very, very simple and straightforward. So the cool season grasses, they simply prefer to grow in cooler temperatures. The warm season grasses, they prefer to grow in warmer temperatures. So for us, we're primarily growing cool season grasses, which means you're going to have more growth in the spring and fall when temperatures are cooler than you might during the heat of the summer. Opposite of that is warm season grasses, where there is much more growth during the heat of the summer than there is in the spring or fall. So I just wanted to point that out before I move on to this slide, where the relative drought tolerance of these grasses is described. So for example, the warm season grasses on the left, they tend to be more drought tolerant than the cool season grasses. That's reflected in the width of the arrow. And then the most tolerant, drought tolerant warm season grass would be Bermuda grass. The least would be the paspalum, seashore paspalum, which may or may not be familiar to you. But then on the cool season side, we've got the wheat grasses, which is the most drought tolerant. And then the ryegrasses would be the least drought tolerant. So there's all this relative difference across species. And again, I'm not even touching on varieties just yet. So it gets that much more, I'll say, interesting, because to me, when we have all those different options, that means we have a lot of options that we can recommend. And that's a good position to be in, I think, because we can be very specific in making recommendations for certain applications. So I'm going to go through some of the ways that we can optimize the water use efficiency of turf grasses. And I'll begin with establishment. So again, this is a resource here in Utah, but a good deal of this information is still relevant to you. And I also like to emphasize, well, I'll just mention that before I was doing anything with turfgrass, I was a soil scientist. So for me, soils are huge. They are really the key to being successful, not only with turfgrass management, but whatever landscape management you're trying to do. So For you all in Wyoming, I would probably direct you more to the Northern Utah fact sheet that you see there. But this just describes how you prepare the soil ahead of either seeding or sodding, in this case, turfgrass, so that you can be most successful. And what I tell folks is that if you can have good preparation with your soils, you know, you're 75, 80% of the way there, right? Because you're creating a good soil environment for that grass to grow in, and a good environment to provide nutrients as well as water. So it's very important when you have the opportunity to prepare the soil properly so that you can be more successful later on. Moving on to mowing, it's sometimes surprising to folks how much mowing, and in particular mowing height, can affect how much water turfgrass requires. So we know there is this range of mowing height for different species. And let's just take, I don't know, tall fescue as an example. So the range of mowing height that we typically recommend there is anywhere from 1.5 to 3 inches. For fine fescues, it's the same. Kentucky bluegrass, it's the same. And I also want to draw your attention to this image here, because what this is showing is, if this is the soil level right here, what you're seeing is that the shorter you mow turfgrass, the shallower the roots are. And we do not want to have shallow roots, especially during times of drought, because we want the turfgrass roots to be able to access moisture as deep in the soil profile as possible. So our recommendation is that you should mow as high as you can, especially during times of drought, so that you're encouraging that deeper rooting. So typically 3 inches is where we like to be. I will tell you that you are typically limited by your mower and how high you can raise your mower. I will also share with you that here at my university, Utah State, we've got a fantastic landscape operations crew. And during the summer months, they're actually mowing some of our more high profile areas at 6 inches on our campus. Now, I don't know many home mowers that'll go that high, but they do that for this reason, to encourage deeper rooting. And it's very, very successful. And they're typically maintaining really terrific high quality turf grasses even through the heat of the summer. So again, that higher mowing height is what we'd like to see. Now, having said that, when you're mowing it higher, you do have more leaf area on the grass, and that additional leaf area can actually increase water use to some extent. It's not like a huge increase, but it can increase it to some extent because you've got more leaf area, more transpiration happening there. If you cut it very short, you've got less leaf area and less transpiration happening there. But it is also, technically speaking, reducing turfgrass water requirement. But if we mow at that increased height, which is definitely what I'm recommending, we actually get increased water use efficiency overall because of the better rooting mass and deeper rooting depth. So that's how you can enhance the depth and extent of rooting, but still minimize leaf surface area. And the way that you do that is you're mowing higher, but you're mowing more often, so that you're not taking off huge amount of leaf surface area each time you mow. So that again is a little bit of the physiology of what's happening there. Now, in terms of fertilization, that's another one that's really, really important in terms of turfgrass drought tolerance. I mean, it definitely influences turfgrass growth and water use. And especially in our part of the world, it's often required to get the level of turfgrass quality that is desired. And that's because our soils tend to not have sufficient nitrogen natively. So we're often enhancing that with fertilizer applications. Could be a synthetic fertilizer, could be an organic fertilizer, could be compost. I mean, there's certainly a lot of different ways to approach that, but we're often fertilizing to enhance turfgrass quality. Having said that, We also don't want, and this relates directly to drought management, we also don't want to put too much fertilizer out there, especially in the form of nitrogen. And the reason for that is if we're putting out too much nitrogen, we're encouraging a whole lot of leaf growth, but that happens very quickly and the roots can't typically keep up with that leaf growth. So you've got all these leaves up at the surface saying, I need water, I need nutrients, I need all the things, but the roots down below are saying, I'm just doing my best, I can't really get there, I need more. So that creates sort of a vicious cycle where the roots are trying to pump up as much water as they can, but the leaves are always demanding more. So the idea then would be to apply an adequate amount of nitrogen and not exceed that. We can talk about what amounts that might be, but that is the general concept there. So there's actually considerable opportunity for manipulating turfgrass water use by manipulating nitrogen fertilization. And again, it's because of that effect of nitrogen on the plant of producing more leaves. So again, avoiding excessive nitrogen fertilization because of the increased water use that I've described, and trying to meet the need, which can be, we have a lot of that information here in Utah. I suspect you have a lot of that information available to you there in Wyoming. I also suspect it's pretty similar. So we can talk more about specifics there. But once you get beyond that critical or efficient level of nitrogen, that's where you start to have problems. That's where root growth can actually be suppressed or even stopped. So then you're really in trouble in terms of, water requirements for the turf grass. Now, there are, of course, other nutrient considerations. We know, for example, that potassium can be incredibly helpful for newly planted areas. It can help with drought recovery, increase rooting mass, decrease wilting tendency, and especially in combination with nitrogen, phosphorus can actually improve drought recovery as well. Another thing, especially in our area of the country to keep in mind, is that iron can actually be very, very important. And sometimes what may appear to be a nitrogen deficiency, so perhaps not as green of a color as you are thinking you might want to see, or perhaps it's going a little bit straw colored or off tan color. That can be caused by iron deficiency as well as nitrogen deficiency. So in combination with nitrogen, iron can actually help to reduce desiccation injury. It can also increase root production. So that's something to keep in mind. And also keep in mind that in this part of the world, our soils may have a lot of iron in them, but it may not be accessible to the plants because it can be so tightly bound in the soil. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that grass clippings actually contain quite a bit of nitrogen. And so if it is your practice to mow and remove clippings, I would strongly encourage you to reconsider that and to return them when you mow as much as you possibly can, because it provides nitrogen to the system, but it also helps to conserve soil moisture. And that is because as the clippings filter down through the turfgrass canopy, they actually sit at the soil surface and they can prevent some evaporation from happening at the soil surface. So that can be helpful. And then kind of the last note, I think, on fertilization, what I often say to folks is, maybe you're not a regular fertilizer person. However, I would always recommend that you apply at least 1 pound of nitrogen in the fall after your last mowing, because that actually helps drought recovery and response the following summer more than anything else you might do. So that's a really important time to fertilize. And I also say to folks, if you're only going to fertilize once a year, that's when you should do it. So that can be incredibly helpful in terms of drought. All right, now moving on with a whole lot more information on irrigation at this point. So with irrigation scheduling, that is one of the ways that we can address turfgrass management through drought. And some general ideas here. So the idea that irrigation should change through the growing season is very, very important. So typically in the spring and fall, when temperatures are lower, that is when irrigation can be less because it's not needed as much. In the heat of the summer, it typically more irrigation is needed, but in those spring and fall months, not so much. Something else to consider with irrigation scheduling is that a lot of irrigation controllers now, and I do a lot of work with irrigation technologies because we've just come so far with those technologies in recent years, and many of those will actually allow you to attach a rain shutoff device, wind shutoff, frost shutoff. Those will stop irrigation during any of those conditions, which is a good way to save water. Another concept, and you've likely heard this, but watering less frequently but deeply so that you have moisture moving down into the soil so that it's available for a longer period of time is another recommendation. Cycling irrigation to avoid ponding or runoff. And what I mean by that is, let's just say you need to irrigate for 15 minutes, but you start to see runoff in 5. The recommendation then would be to cycle that irrigation. So irrigate for 5 minutes, wait an hour. Irrigate for another 5 minutes, then wait an hour, and then irrigate for your last 5 minutes. You're still irrigating for 15 minutes total, but you're not losing a lot of that water to runoff. So that is something that we often recommend. It's especially helpful for high clay soils. It's also especially helpful for high sand content soils where that moisture can move through so quickly that it goes right past the root zone of the plants you're trying to irrigate. On the positive side, a lot of irrigation controllers these days have that capacity, so it's not as though you have to be out there, turning it on and off every hour or so. And this is also the same concept of matching the application of water to the soil's infiltration rate. So that's that same kind of concept. And then considering temperature and wind when you're deciding on irrigation scheduling. Now there are high-tech solutions, but there are also low-tech solutions. And I will tell you that in my research, the low-tech solutions can be just as effective as the high-tech solutions if you are consistent in how you apply them. So doing things like minimizing overspray onto surfaces you're not trying to irrigate. So I'm thinking here of sidewalks, driveways, streets, things of that nature. Making sure that the water pressure is appropriate for the sprinklers that you're using. A lot of folks don't realize that sprinklers are designed to operate at very specific water pressures. And if that pressure is too low, there are problems. And if that pressure is too high, there are problems. So making sure that that's okay. Compensating with your irrigation design in cases of high wind, and then routine maintenance. And this is the one I really want to focus on here for low-tech solutions. This is simple stuff, simple stuff. So fixing leaks and breaks, leveling sprinkler heads because they often become tilted, unclogging nozzles, doing an irrigation audit, which is essentially that, looking at the irrigation system in operation so that problems can be identified. We have had an irrigation auditing program here in Utah for, oh my gosh, 25 years, a little more, in fact. And I will tell you that the problems we see most often are tilted sprinkler heads and sunken sprinkler heads. And both of those have a huge bearing on how efficiently the water is applied. But if you don't ever see your irrigation system in operation, and many people don't because it's happening at night, you're not going to be able to find those problems. So I would strongly encourage you to have a look at your irrigation system in operation during the daylight hours so that you can see what problems might exist and what needs to be fixed. And a lot of these things are pretty simple. Leveling heads, so it involves a little bit of digging, but that's not too difficult to do. It's not too difficult to raise a sunken head either. So these are things that most folks are able to do. Now, that's on the lower tech side, but of course we do have higher tech solutions. Some irrigation systems operate with soil moisture sensors. And so those are attached to an irrigation controller, and they either allow or don't allow irrigation based on how much moisture is in the soil. So that is one high-tech approach. I have seen, and we do use subsurface drip irrigation for certain turfgrass areas. It is incredibly effective, and it avoids loss of irrigation water to evaporation. Rather expensive, however, I will say that. And then we can have integrated weather and irrigation systems. So, you know, the image there, for example, I have evaluated a lot of different irrigation controllers. Some of them have their own, what I would call like a mini weather station directly wired to the controller. Others might receive weather data that is local and allow irrigation based on that information. Lots of different ways that they do that. Lots of different ways that the controllers receive the information. Most recently, some of the smart irrigation controllers are getting that information through Wi-Fi. So they're using your internet to actually get weather data that's local to you and allow irrigation based on that weather data. And then other approaches, and I'm going to show you an example of this in just a minute, is taking a community approach to irrigation scheduling. So for example, here in Utah, our state's Division of Water Resources, and we have worked with them on this, puts out this weekly lawn watering guide every week during the growing season. They've got one guide there on the left for standard turf grasses, and then one guide there on the right for low water use turf grasses, because we are strongly promoting the use of low water use turf grasses here in the state of Utah. And it's fantastic that the state's Division of Water Resources provides this information for everyone in the state. So in case it's too tiny, I just want to point out that on this left-hand figure, it's recommending 3 waterings per week right now. On the right, the low water use turf is recommending 2 waterings per week right now. So if you think about the fact that a typical landscape will use 3,000 gallons of water every time the irrigation comes on, when you're reducing that irrigation 1 time per week, if you think about the whole growing season, that's a whole lot of water that can be saved. So again, we're strongly promoting these low water use grasses here. This is just showing the weather stations that are used to inform these maps and these recommendations. So we've got weather stations throughout the state that are collecting data. That data is used to model evapotranspiration and create those weekly lawn watering recommendations. We also have, and I would be curious to know from you all, but here in Utah, we also have programs where residents in the state can apply for rebates for things like toilet replacement. Now, we're not talking about toilets here today, but on the indoor water use side of things, toilets are a very high water user. So that's an example of the type of support that's provided here. Also, anybody in our state can get a rebate for a smart irrigation controller. So you purchase a smart irrigation controller and you will get a rebate for a portion of its purchase price. And there are other programs as well in the state. Now, as far as smart controllers go, that's another thing that I really promote a lot. And that's because of research that we've done here with these controllers demonstrating just really huge amounts of savings. So one of the first sets of controllers I tested were the Weathermatic, the Rainbird, and Hunter, the 3 on the right. Those all use weather data from some source to schedule irrigation. They use, they have different types of programming, but the idea here is that they all use weather data to either allow or not allow irrigation. And so I've tested those types of controllers. More recently, I've tested the Wi-Fi enabled controllers. I mentioned the Wi-Fi ones. So we typically use a Hunter controller for our standard controller, but then we were looking at the Beehive controller, which is made here in Utah, Rachio, and the Skydrop, which unfortunately is no longer in business because it really did a fantastic job. But these are the types of products that we've done some research with. And just to share some of the results with you, so our typical folks here in the state are really over irrigating, applying as much as 48 inches of irrigation annually. That is a whole lot. But the climate-based controllers, that was the first group I showed you, those, when we program them and use them in our research, they reduced water applications from 35 to 51%. So if we can take that 48 inches of water and reduce it by half, that is a huge amount of savings. And we had pretty similar results with the Wi-Fi based controllers. So they reduce water anywhere from 29 to 55%. So again, these have huge potential for water savings. But I will also note that when we program a standard controller with information that we have from our climate center or from local weather stations, we can also achieve a similar amount of savings because we're changing that irrigation schedule week by week to reflect what's happening with the weather. So my point is that while these smart controllers can save a lot of water and sort of automate the process and take the guesswork out of it, if you know what you're doing and you're careful, you can also save a whole lot of water. So, we promote these controllers strongly in the state because I think a lot of folks don't want to have to think about it a lot. They just want it to be functional. They want the right amount of irrigation, but not to overdo it. So these smart irrigation controllers can be very helpful. And lastly, I'll just add that in this study, we were certainly looking at the overall volume of water applied, but we also looked at the quality of the landscapes, because I am well aware that if you're saving a lot of water, but the landscape looks terrible, that's not going to be a sustainable situation, right? So what we were after were products that would save a lot of water and maintain a high quality landscape. And that was true in the case of these controllers that we evaluated. So really, really positive results there. Now I mentioned that we've had an irrigation auditing program here for 26, 25, somewhere in there, a long time. And we have, and I've been managing the program for about 20 of those years, so quite a while. And with this program, we have folks sign up online, and then I hire and train employees every summer to conduct what we call water checks, but it's essentially an irrigation audit. And we send them out to folks' homes to do the assessment. We also provide support to do this work if they want to do it for themselves, a DIY approach. And that's something that we sometimes direct folks to, especially if we are not able to provide in-person service in their area. And we also have fact sheets for pretty much any place in the state that describes how you would do this process for yourself. But again, it's really sort of the low-tech solution where you're going out, you're actually looking at the sprinkler system in operation. Maybe you're borrowing catch cups like you see here in the on the fact sheets from your local county extension offices, which is something we make available here in the state. Maybe you're borrowing those cups and being a little more intentional with it. But again, just looking at the system in operation and determining where the problems are can go a long way towards reducing outdoor water use. Now, the other thing that I think is important to understand is that our cool season turf grasses, which is what you're primarily growing and what we're primarily growing, do tend to enter dormancy during the heat of the summer. I spend a lot of time every summer talking to folks about explaining that this is not dead turf grass. This is simply dormant turf grass. And the other thing I like to say is it's kind of like trees in the fall, right? Our deciduous trees drop their leaves, but do we think they're dead? No, we don't. We know that they are just dormant and they're waiting for spring when they'll leaf out again. It's very similar with turfgrass dormancy. So that's something that we talk about. And how can you tell? So, we know based on research, and I'm going to show you some pictures here in a minute, and I really got to speed myself up here, that as little as a 1/4 inch of water per month during the growing season can actually keep turf grasses alive. They will go dormant, but they do come back quite reliably. And we actually did a study to evaluate this during our last big drought in 2021. But we had this 18-year-old stand of bluegrass, not low water use, just standard bluegrass. But it either got a 1/4 inch of water per month, 1/2 inch of water per month, or 1 inch of water per month, applied at one time. And we watched to see what would happen. And what happened was, yes, everything went dormant, no question. But by the fall, things started coming back. And by the time we entered winter, everything had come back completely. So even those plots that were only getting a 1/4 inch of water per month were coming back quite reliably. Now we also do a lot of trialing of different types of turf grasses because we know that turf grasses can still be functional even under drought, but we do want to select those varieties and species that require the least amount of water. So we put them through a lot of different experiments where we're doing different kinds of drought evaluation. Some of that might be chronic drought, where we're just reducing irrigation by half through the growing season. But more often, what we do are acute drought experiments, meaning that once the grass varieties are established, we stop irrigating. And we don't irrigate again until the best performing variety reduces to 25% green cover, at which point we start to rewater and look at how much is required for recovery. So we do a ton of these types of evaluations. And just so you know what this looks like, this is us installing a new trial. Those tiny squares are where we're looking at different varieties. Here is as it was getting established. Obviously, there are a lot of weeds in this photo, but that's kind of what we have to do during the establishment process, and we take care of those a bit later on. And some of these projects we actually do under rainout shelters because we don't want natural precipitation to affect the results. And I want to just show you as an example the difference in turfgrass green cover after 50 days with no water. You can see on the left, that is a Kentucky bluegrass variety called Mallard. It's still got 38% green cover after 50 days. But this other one, Geronimo, only 2% green cover after 50 days. So both are varieties of Kentucky bluegrass, but they had incredibly different responses to acute drought. So that's the type of work that we often do. And just to demonstrate how we're using these low water use grasses here in Utah, we actually worked with Salt Lake City to establish a program to distribute low water use grasses in the city. And they wanted their annual irrigation requirement to be no more than about 18 inches as compared to about 35. So we worked with them on that. And we also worked with the Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance to choose the varieties that they would use. Then we worked with the city to develop a demonstration area. So this was a pump station on the west side of the city. The existing turf was mowed really, really short. Then we used non-selective herbicide to spray it out. We overseeded directly into that existing turfgrass stubble, covered it with compost, irrigated it, and had it very well established within just over a month. So what did that look like? Before, on the left, which you can see there is, it's a larger turfgrass area, but this was also meant to demonstrate what you might do if you were, maybe you wanted to expand your planting bed area. So you might do that, but maybe you also wanted to have low water use turfgrass in the areas where you were maintaining turfgrass. So this is what it looked like after it was established. And I can tell you that the water use on this site has been reduced by 50%. Incidentally, the mowing requirements have also been significantly reduced. So the city can direct folks there to see what it might look like, but it's been an incredibly successful program and it sells out constantly. So we've certainly got water resource issues, no question. But we can use what we know about turfgrass water use requirements and physiology to help us manage them through drought, to optimize water use efficiency. And of course, irrigation scheduling is critical to this process, as is the use of lower water use turfgrass species and varieties. And that's all I wanted to share, and I wanted to leave a little time for questions. So I'm going to stop there. I will stop sharing my screen, and then Jeremiah, if you want to maybe share some Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Cope. Yeah, please put your questions in the Q&A. We already have a few in here, so I'm going to just walk through them. We really appreciate it. That was really excellent. So the first question I have for you, Dr. Cope, I'm not sure if you can see it on your end, but I'll just read them, even if you can. Uh, this comes from a participant, and she says, I have heard that blue grama grass can be used as turf grass. I'm in
Yep.
Buffalo, Wyoming, which is a zone 4B. Would this be an option for me? And she also had a follow-up saying she has around 11,000 square feet of lawn and I'm looking for more water-wise grass options.
Yeah, I think it would be an option for you, but one thing I'll just caution you about a little bit. Because blue grama is a warm season grass, that means it really likes those warmer temperatures. So it's going to have a little bit of an extended dormancy in the spring, and it's going to go dormant a little more quickly in the fall. So for some folks, that's kind of a deal breaker. But we're not talking about huge amounts of time here. You know, in our climate, at our research farm, we're a little bit warmer than you are, but we're talking about 2 to 3 weeks difference in terms of when it starts to green up. But maybe something else for you to consider is some of the low water use cool season varieties. That would also be an option for you. And another thing to consider is people sometimes very much like the look of buffalo grass and blue grama mixed, and those are both warm season grasses. So that can be a really nice combination and quite low water use as well.
I have a follow-up question on that, Dr. Cope, as you've been talking about that. When would be the appropriate time to switch to a new grass species like that? We're right in the middle of drought. We're right in the middle of summer. Should I do it now? Should I wait? How's that work?
Yeah. Yeah, so it depends on if you're thinking of a cool season or a warm season grass. But if you're thinking of a cool season grass, I would say you should wait until the fall when temperatures are cooler, because that's when it prefers to grow anyway, and there's less annual weed pressure. So that's what I would say. If you're going from seed, that's what I would say. If you're thinking of warm season grasses, you're going to want to plant, you can do those in the summertime because that's when they like to grow, but you are going to have some annual weed pressure. Keep in mind, especially in a year like this, when you're establishing new grasses, that water requirement is rather high. So that's another reason to wait for fall for cool season grasses. And for the warm season, if it were me, honestly, I might even wait until next year to see if our conditions aren't a bit better.
Well, and if
Yeah.
you're probably in some water restrictions, you might need to wait
Yes.
until you have adequate water to get the lawn established. And once it's
Absolutely.
established, then it goes into that drought resistance that we want.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
perfect. Perfect. Okay, our next question is, as you're going through the various types of species, this individual asks, what species are we most likely to see in our typical urban lawns?
Yeah. So if I had a bet, you've probably got Kentucky bluegrass mixed with tall fescue, mixed with perennial ryegrass. If I had to guess, you might have some fine fescue in there, which tends to dominate in shady areas. It's got a very narrow leaf. So could be any combination of those. It's very unusual to have just one species. You might have several varieties of one species, but those are absolutely the most common urban lawn type species for sure.
And if I'm not mistaken, those are the most common grass seed mixes on the shelf to purchase.
Absolutely. Yep. Maybe that's why they're most obvious. Yeah.
Okay, our next question. Do you recommend slow release nitrogen fertilizers versus maybe faster release fertilizers? And how often should that be applied?
Okay. So a typical schedule for cool season grasses, which is what we're mostly doing. So we typically recommend 4 fertilizations across the growing season. So spring, early summer, late fall. The first 3 of those, spring, early summer, late summer, should be slow release. Slow release. You want that to be gradually released to the grass. That last fertilization in the fall, the one I talked about, the one I said, if there's only one you're going to do that one. That should be quick release. And it should be applied after the last mowing while the grass is still green. But it's a great question. I mean, I could talk to you guys for hours about turfgrass. Jeremiah only gave me 1 hour. What can I tell you?
We're stingy. We're stingy, Dr. Cope.
Okay.
Our next question, you said apply 1 pound of nitrogen fertilizer in the fall after mowing. Is that 1 pound per square foot or some other area dimension?
Great question, Judy. So that is 1 pound per 1,000 square feet, and it's 1 pound of nitrogen. So the actual weight of product is going to depend on which product you use, right? And I suspect, Jeremiah, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I suspect you guys have lots of resources on how you do fertilizer. Okay,
Yeah, we
good.
have a little bit there, but just, yeah, clarification, the fertilizer comes in different percentages of nitrogen in the composition,
Yes.
and thus you need to do a little bit of math to get the right amount. So it's a pound of nitrogen, not a pound of fertilizer product going out. But yes, we got some of those resources,
Exactly.
but if they're not able to get them, talk to your county extension office, or you can look it up on the Utah State University's website as well. So
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
okay, this one's a little bit long, really good information. This individual lives in Parkman, Wyoming, elevation of 4,347 feet, which is in Sheridan County, located in
Uh-huh.
northwest Wyoming, about 3 miles from the Montana border. Her question is, what do you recommend for making an above ground watering system from a well? Often the well pressure is not strong enough to get water to part of the yard that has a slight uphill grade. I can see that using an above ground pivoting sprinkler wastes a lot of water. Any
Hmm.
recommendations?
Hmm. Well, hmm. Yes, here's a recommendation. Can you put a pump on that so you can get adequate pressure? I mean, it's like I said, sprinklers are designed to operate at certain pressures. So, like a standard lawn sprinkler, you're going to want to have 15 to 30 psi typically. So, even if you could just do a small pump to help with that, and above ground pivoting sprinklers don't have to waste a lot of water. I mean, if you're avoiding high wind and high temperature, that can be helpful. If you are very aware of how much water is applied each time you irrigate, that can be very helpful if you relate it to the amount of water that's lost from the system. But adequate pressure is the number one variable with irrigation. Number one, no question. So if you could at all deal with that and have adequate pressure, that would be my first recommendation. As far as being above ground, it's kind of like building an erector set, right? You've got PVC, you've got elbows, sometimes you've got stuff we call funny pipe, and you've got sprinklers. That's pretty straightforward. And I would also add to that a typical irrigation design, you've got heads that are laid out either in squares or triangles. And that is also a very efficient way to do it. Now, I have no way of knowing the shape of your yard here, but those are my general recommendations. And I couldn't give you a dollar cost on a pump, but I'm not sure how much you would need to increase the pressure either. But that's what I would recommend actually.
Well, and I know in Wyoming, some of our wells just don't produce enough water as well, and then have low pressure
Oh,
as well.
okay.
And so I don't know the full situation here, but I guess
Yeah.
what I'd like to add to what you just said is it would be worth talking to a plumber or an irrigation company or specialist to come in and look at your specific system and
Uh-huh.
engineer a system for that sprinkler system if your well water is not enough water or not enough pressure to help you combat that. Because it can be something as simple as the well might fill a tank, a reserve tank that has a separate pump that goes to the sprinkler system or things like
Mhm.
that. But you got to have it
Yeah.
kind of engineered specifically for your system to make it work.
The other thought I have, and you kind of touched on it there, Jeremiah, what with the reserve tank, I was thinking, like old timey water towers, right? The way those work is you got the water up there, and the pressure of gravity actually moves it through, right? So
Right.
maybe there would be a way to accumulate water in a tank with a little bit of gravity to give you a little more pressure. That might be another thought, but again, we need to know a lot more information.
A lot more variables, but hopefully
Yeah,
that gives them enough to get started and
yeah,
going. Yeah.
hopefully. Yeah.
Okay, our next one. You said to water less often but deep. How do you know
Yeah.
how to program our irrigation system so we know that we're doing that?
Yes, excellent question. So what we do, what we recommend is that you apply half an inch of water each time you irrigate. And the idea there is that in most soils, that will move the moisture into the soil deep enough for most turfgrass roots. So the way you know that is you could use like we use those catch cups that I mentioned in the presentation, but you could even use like soup cans, something of that nature, so that you determine how long you have to run your sprinklers to get half an inch of water. So that information combined with evapotranspiration information from where you live is how you figure this out. So I showed you that weekly lawn watering guide. That's based on applying half an inch of water each time you irrigate. So if it's saying irrigate 3 times per week, that's an inch and a half of water. And that's just to replace a portion of what's lost to evapotranspiration. But getting that time frame for half an inch, that's what you want to do each time you irrigate. And then what changes is the frequency. So how many days in between those irrigations? I hope that makes sense. But that's very dependent on evapotranspiration where you are now. Jeremiah, you can help me here. I'm not sure what your weather station network is like in Wyoming or how you might provide that information.
It's challenging. Let me put it that way. It's
Okay.
Wyoming.
Okay.
We do have weather station networks across the state, of course, but they're not very densely populated, right? And so we
Okay.
see a lot of variance between stations. And so it's
Okay.
very hard. And then also the type of data that comes out from each station is not always identical. And so
Uh,
we don't have an ET rate map like you do. That's a really cool system. It would be awesome to put that here. We've had discussions at the university of how to make that happen. But that's some of our challenges is we just don't have enough weather stations in all the places and
well, here's
gathering the same data is what I
yeah,
understand.
okay. Well, here's another thought because you probably have historic weather data that you can work from, right?
Correct.
So, what we use as a baseline is that historic weather data. So, we typically
Okay.
consider our irrigation season from like May to September. And we know, for example, that in May, ET is typically whatever, X inches of water. So you could also use that kind of information as a starting point and then use your own observation to say, okay, I'm irrigating twice a week right now, but things look great. Maybe I could back off. Or I'm irrigating twice per week right now and things don't look good at all. So maybe you might add an irrigation. So there's some amount of data involved, but there's also a good bit of observation involved. So
Yep.
hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I think we answered that one. I'm new to using an irrigation system this year and saw something on it about water cycling. I think
Yes.
you covered this. Can you go over it briefly again?
Sure, sure. So this, let's just say you were trying to irrigate for 15 minutes and you wanted to cycle that irrigation, which is something you really can't go wrong with cycling irrigation. But you started to see runoff after 5 minutes. You might run it for 5 minutes, wait an hour, run it for another five, wait an hour, run it for another five, wait an hour. You still get the 15 minutes. It's just you're not getting any runoff. And it sounds to me like your controller probably has that capacity built in, which is great. That's great.
Great. This is just follow up from what we were talking about with the situation in Parkman of the pump and all that of the well pump. So
Yes.
I think we answered this, but just to clarify, she put in here that is adding a pump outside of that spigot helpful? And so again, at least from my perspective, love to hear what you have to say, Dr. Cope. It depends on the system and all that. And most of the time, if you're going to add a pump outside of the current well system, it probably would need to go into a tank, then for that pump to pick it up and push it on from there, and it would be more
Yes.
consistent pressure. You can't just hook a pump on the end of a spigot and pump and get better pressure.
Right.
So it would be a kind of a tiered system like that.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yep.
Okay, we'll get through those. Okay, we have another one. Can you overseed with a lot low water bluegrass? Don't want to
Okay.
kill the existing grass with a herbicide, but as I overseed, can I overseed with a lower water use species or variety, excuse me?
You could, but it wouldn't grow. So I'm sorry to say it that way, but maybe you don't want to use an herbicide. That's okay. I don't know how big your area is, but another way that you can kill the existing grass is with a process we call solarization, where you're literally covering it with clear plastic and you just let the sun do the job. It just cooks the grass underneath it. That's another way to do it. But you really do need to kill the existing grass, because if you don't, it's going to outcompete whatever seed you put down. So,
Perfect. Okay. All right. Our last question, unless we get others. How do we know if thatch has become too thick and needs to be raked out to prevent runoff? And how does aerating lawns help with drought resistance in any way?
ooh, good question. Okay. So, too thick. First, I'll start with that. So, a small amount of thatch is absolutely normal. It's okay. In fact, it's desirable. But what I mean by that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/4, no more than 1/2 inch. If it starts to get to be more than that, that's a problem. And the reason that's a problem is that the turf grass starts rooting into that thatch layer, and that thatch layer is just dead roots and stems for the most part. It's really fluffy. It's not dense at all. It doesn't retain any water. So if the grass is rooting into that thatch layer, it's going to constantly be looking for water. It's going to constantly be drought stressed. So that's why we don't want to have too much thatch. Um, as far as aerating goes, aerating can definitely help with that. And we usually recommend core aerating, where it pulls those small plugs. You can usually rent those machines or hire someone to do it. But what that does is it encourages air and water movement into the soil beneath the thatch, and it actually stimulates the microorganisms in the soil to decompose the thatch naturally, which is what we want to have happen. It's also a great time to fertilize, by the way. But that is how you can deal with thatch. And how does it help? Yes, it definitely helps with drought resistance, because you've got more active microbes, you've got less thatch, you've got the capacity of that soil to provide more moisture and nutrients over time. So in addition to providing or applying fertilizer during that time, you can also apply organic material. So, I'm thinking something like compost or sometimes peat moss or things of that nature, because you want that organic material to go into the soil to build the organic matter content of our soils, which are terribly low in organic matter, both in Wyoming and Utah. You want to build that up, because that organic material in the soil is what actually retains moisture and nutrients. So it will definitely help with drought resistance. And then how often should you aerate? I'm going to say you probably have cool season lawns. And so you could do it in the spring or the fall. I don't personally have a thatch issue, so I don't ever aerate. I did aerate when I was transitioning my own yard to low water use turf, but if you do have a thatch problem, I would say spring or fall, because that's when the grass is actively growing and it can heal and recover very quickly. Yeah.
So once a year, as essentially either in the spring or fall. Perfect. Perfect.
Yes.
I think you got through them, Dr. Cole. I
Okay.
don't see any other questions. We must have just overwhelmed them
Maybe
with
so.
everything, but this was fantastic. Really appreciate your time.
Sure.
With that, I'm going to stop the webinar and move on, but we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. For
You're
the
welcome.
participants, please be watching um, for an email from us, and we'll be gathering input from you of what else we could maybe do, but also how useful this webinar was. So with that, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.